So week 3, we are into products liability, strict liability, and chapter 7 as well. But we're going to start with chapter 6. Again, you can open it right up in Canvas. You don't have to access it any other way. Products liability is the liability of manufacturers, sellers, lessors, and others for injury of defective products. Obviously, we're dealing with products, so that should hopefully make sense to you. Strict liability means a plaintiff may recover punitive or punishment damages if the defendant's conduct has been intentional or reckless. And we'll get into that in a little further depth. Negligence. Negligence requires the defendant to be at fault for causing the plaintiff's injuries. They must prove that the plaintiff, 1, had a duty to act with reasonable care towards the plaintiff. That duty was breached, causing injury, actual and proximate, and that the injury was an actual injury. It wasn't something that was potential or possible. It actually has to have occurred. Failure to exercise reasonable care includes failing to assemble a product design, negligent inspection or testing, or negligent packaging. Now, looking at misrepresentation, this is a little bit different in the context that it's held out to do something it does not, or it conceals a defect in it. Recovery is limited to the person who relied on the misrepresentation. So, for instance, if you purchased a pair of shoes to, say, walk through hot coals, I don't know why you would do that, but let's say you do that. And the shoes are actually flammable, so when you step in hot coals, they light your feet on fire. Now, if an individual didn't buy them to walk through hot coals, simply bought them because of their appearance, they would not be able to sue for misrepresentation because they didn't use them for that actual purpose. The doctrine of strict liability means that you are liable without fault. So if you are under the doctrine of strict liability, that means you will be held accountable even if there was not fault incurred on your own. So manufacturers, distributors, wholesalers, and retailers are within the chain of distribution of a defective product. So they would be held responsible. Liability without fault does not require the injured person to prove that the defendant breached the duty of care. It just shows that there is, in fact, a duty and that duty was breached. They don't actually have to show that the chain of command was what caused it. Casual sales, so say someone that sells on eBay or at a garage sale, are not covered under strict liability for products liability. The chain of distribution, as we said, is manufacturers, distributors, wholesalers and retailers, lessors, or subcomponent manufacturers. So they make smaller parts for the whole product. All parties within this chain are strictly liable. They can recover, parties who can recover, again, the injured party, privity of contract. So let's say they bought it from an eBay dealer. They could still hold the product company liable. They can't hold the person that sold it on eBay liable, but they can hold the product person, the company liable, excuse me. Damages are recoverable, vary by jurisdiction. Property damage is sometimes recoverable, say there's an explosion, economic loss in a few jurisdictions, and then we have some civil caps depending on your tort legislation and kind of where you're allowed to have those caps. To recover for strict liability, the injured party must first show that the product caused the injury, and that the injured party does not have to prove that the product, how it became defective, unless they are the individuals that caused the defect. So if it was not defective from the company or from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer can prove that the injured party caused the damage, then they would not be held liable. And again, we're looking at defect in manufacturing, design, packaging, failure to warn if there's an injury, or inadequate instructions. So let's first look at defective in design. So if there's a defect in the design of how a product was made, They're going to look at the risk utility analysis and then a consumer expectation test. So did the consumers expect to use that product for what it was designed for? So again, if you're using shoes to walk through hot coals, they would need to be designed for that specifically. The crashworthiness doctrine states that an automobile manufacturer has a duty to design an automobile taking into account the possibility of a second collision. So it has to hold together for further collisions down the road. They should take into account the possibility of harm from a person's body striking something inside, say, the dashboard, the wheel, anything like that. Failure to warn is the second prong, or second issue. If the defect occurs when a manufacturer does not place a warning on the package, and it could cause injury if the danger is unknown. Proper and conspicuous warning insulate all chain of distribution. So if it's conspicuous, meaning it's vague or an individual doesn't understand the warning, and remember we use the reasonable person test, then it's going to be held invalid. Defect in packaging is another. So if the container should in fact be tamper-proof, and it should show if it was in fact tampered with. So that's why we see seals on milk, seals on juices. You can tell if somebody opened it and drank out of it because of the tamper. It would be clearly shown by the lid being off. And then other products, we're looking at failure to provide adequate instructions. If it's something that's difficult to use or not normally used, it would need adequate instructions. Testing products is another one, or improper certification of safety. So if they haven't followed through and really tested it. Certain dangers of a product, if something is inherently dangerous, you're still normally going to see a warning. Sellers are not strictly liable for failing to warn on general known dangers. So let's say you have a razor. You don't have to write that the razor is sharp. Obviously, it's used to cut things, so that's not going to be a warning that's necessary. Government contractor's defense, so the contractor that manufactures products to government specifications are not usually liable if it causes injury, because obviously the government is contracting for a specific thing. They kind of know the inherent dangers. And then if it's misused, a company is not normally liable if it's a way something is not normally used. If there is a supervening or an act that happens in between using the product and the injury, they're not going to be held liable as well. Assumption of the risk. So if a plaintiff knew and appreciated the risk and still voluntarily assumed the risk, they're going to be a defense to products liability. So you know a razor's sharp, you cut yourself substantially, you're probably not going to be able to sue for that. Again, there is in fact a statute of limitations on civil cases. It's 2 years. You must bring an action within that time for a defective product. Statute of repose limits the seller's liability to a certain number of years. So you can't just continue to sue a company, 35 years after the product was manufactured. If the plaintiff was at fault, they're also going to limit liability. And then contributory negligence. Again, so if they contributed to their own injury, they're not going to be able to recover damages. Hopefully you don't have any questions, but if you do, again, feel free to email me and I'll see you in Chapter 7.